Hello, everyone. In this episode of Think on This with MHA Lakeshore, I spoke with Kaitlyn Keneally, winner of numerous awards, including Woman of Achievement 2022, Young Professional of the Year 2021, Brains Magazine 500 Global List 2021, She Row in 2021, and Woman of Vision and Courage in 2012 through 2013. Kaitlyn Keneally is a licensed professional counselor and holds degrees in History and Women's Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and Counseling. As a psychotherapist, she specializes in trauma and PTSD, domestic violence, sexual abuse, anxiety, depression, and self-esteem. She is direct, solution-focused, and passionate about removing barriers to getting individuals and families the services that they need. In addition to her private practice, Kaitlyn is proactively involved in many different mental health services and outreach programs. Her podcast, Tea Time with the Psychos, aims to break down the stigma surrounding mental illness. Kaitlyn also just wrote her first book titled Healing is Messy AF, which is phenomenal and I highly recommend it. The reason I wanted to talk to Kaitlyn is because she's an amazing clinician and such a courageous person whom I admire greatly. She's able to break down the boundaries around stigmatized topics related to mental health, gender inequality, and social justice. I find the way that she speaks about these issues is clear, informative, and refreshingly candid. She also has such a great sense of humor and an infectious laugh. We had a lot of fun recording this conversation, and I hope you all enjoy it. Welcome back to the Think on This podcast with Mental Health America Lakeshore. I'm your host, Keegan Reines. Mental Health America Lakeshore is a nonprofit resource and referral agency based in eastern Wisconsin. We are dedicated to helping individuals access mental health services and providing community education around mental health topics. The Think on This podcast is a broad look at the world of mental health in the hopes that through the stories of those who engage in mental health each day, we can provide much-needed clarity to this subject. Some of these conversations may be difficult for listeners due to the nature of these topics. If you are ever feeling overwhelmed, I invite you to pause the conversation and take care of yourself. There is no need to power through this podcast, as you can always come back to it later. Please be aware that nothing said here consists of medical advice, and if you are struggling with a mental illness, reach out to the appropriate professional. Lastly, I want to take the time to thank you for listening to this podcast. Our vision is that through these conversations, we can create mentally healthy communities where all individuals thrive. By listening, you are a part of that mission. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for being here and being on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. I know Kaitlyn
Absolutely.
Personally. I've done some work with her, and I think she's such an awesome person to talk to and has such a great personality. And she also has her own podcast, which would you like to introduce?
Absolutely. So if you're interested in podcasts and you want to hear one that talks about mental health issues while also addressing other fun topics, our podcast is called Tea Time with the Psychos.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah. And both of you have such great personalities to talk about these kinds of things, and I always have a blast listening to them. So everybody should go on and listen to Tea Time with Psychos. With the Psychos. My bad. Tea Time with the Psychos. And yeah, it's just phenomenal. So I wanted to kind of just get a little introduction into all the different things you do, because you do like 50,000 different things at the same time. And so if you could just give me a little bit of the lowdown on all the things that you do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am a psychotherapist. I have my LPC. I also own my own private practice, which is called Keneally Counseling, and it's in the Fond du Lac location. I am also an author with just published a book, Healing is Messy AF. I have a podcast, which is called Tea Time with the Psychos. So we do that as well. We were just featured in Women's Quarterly too, which I just thought was so exciting and so much fun. Yeah, our podcast was. So that was good. I also co-chair, the Suicide Prevention Committee and Mental Health Access Committee in town. I work on a lot of different initiatives. And right now I'm working on one for suicide prevention with NAMI Fond du Lac. So more to be announced on that. I also am putting together different coaching programs. And yeah, I mean, as far as professional stuff, that's a lot that's on my plate right now.
Yeah, so pretty much everything.
Yeah, and I provide therapy. Yeah, and I'm a therapist.
And yeah, can't leave that out. Yeah. So could you give me a little introduction into like your motivations? Why are you passionate about mental health? Why do you want to do all the 50,000 different things that you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I'm passionate about the most when it comes to mental health is really working towards breaking the stigma. And I want to do that outside of my four walls. So I think it's really important to be advocating within the four walls of therapy, but then on the outside as well. And the only way we're really going to work towards breaking the stigma is if we're out there, we're talking about it. So these other modalities are a part of breaking that stigma. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When I first started college, though, I wanted to be an actress. Well, then I graduated, and then I went to and got my first master's degree in gender and women's studies. Then I worked as an academic advisor. And when I was an advisor, I was like, everything I'm doing is counseling, right? Getting to the root of the problem. So then I moved back home and got a second master's degree in community and mental health counseling. And I've really found like what I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't want to be just sitting in the office and like, I want to be out and showing that truly to make effective change and to break that stigma, we have to be able to see us. So you get to see me in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. And a lot of things that you work on within therapy are stigma pieces within the public. Yeah. So really working in therapy at some of these changes that need to be made, that's only half of the coin. Yeah. And creating a society that has less stigma around mental health and mental illness is really that other side of the coin, making sure that people have an environment where they feel safe and they feel like they can be who they are.
100%. And that's really what so the book is like a supplement to that. It's kind of a soft sell on therapy. I mean, each chapter is a different mental health topic that, talks about my personal experience, my clinical experience, mixed in with patient testimonial, and then also gives people practical and tangible skills that they can walk away with. So, that's the kind of vision. And that's also what, I'm working on as well.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun reading too. You incorporate a lot of your own sense of humor into it, which I love. Yeah. And you incorporate some Harry Potter quotes, which is the key to my heart. So her book, Healing is Messy AF. And if anybody is confused what AF means, it's as fudge. At least that's what it is here.
Yes.
And you incorporate a lot of different information, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. You touch on a lot of different mental health aspects, from anxiety to trauma, domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. Well, what brought you to write this book?
Oh, sure.
What's your real thesis for this book?
Yeah. So since my first master's degree, I took an autobiography class, and I always wanted to write one, right? Or write something. Now, I've started and stopped probably like 7 or 8 different books. But I took this course, and it talked about like honing in on one idea. And then when the pandemic hit, and then the mental health, and, all these things, I was like, Kaitlyn, everything you're talking about, let's condense it. And this book is really, to me, this book is just the beginning, because each chapter of that book could be its own book. So it's kind of like the appetizer, that I like to say, of mental health. But how I came about the topics were things that I was constantly talking about in session, right? I pulled some, family and friends. What would you want to learn about? Stress was huge. Kaitlyn, what about stress, right? Anxiety was big. Self-care was big. But then I interwove those with, there's a chapter on suicide ideation because it's something that I'm like every day. So really taking the topics that I'm dealing with every day and then putting them into a book and then creating it so that it makes therapy less scary, makes it tangible and like, okay, because after you read the book, or even a chapter of the book, that's something that we would do in a session or multiple sessions. So truthfully, you're getting the exposure without recognizing you're getting the exposure. And then the therapeutic concepts that are in there, it's taking them and breaking them down because no one that comes into my office, really understands the different, and they shouldn't, right? Because they're not necessarily trained in it. They're not looking at the modalities. They're looking at, can you help me with this trauma? And what are some tools and some skills? Because I need to operate on my day-to-day basis. I need to manage this anxiety. I need to manage this stress. And so it was breaking down these bigger concepts, putting them into something that's bite-sized and manageable. And also throwing in a bit of my humor and all of that stuff too. So my personality couldn't be outside of it. But truthfully, before a couple of the revisions, that was part of the issue I felt was that I didn't put enough or my tone wasn't in there. It just didn't feel right. So I didn't want to make the book about me, but so I put snippets of myself in there. And so, so once I did that, it felt better as well. And I think that that's a big piece that people resonate with is because, granted, I sit in the seat that I sit and I earned it, but it doesn't make me any better than anybody else or above anybody. We're all on the same playing field in that regards. And so, it kind of levels it out, in my opinion.
And you just set me up perfectly for something that I wanted to get into, which was that personal bit of therapy where I feel there's a misunderstanding that only the client is coming in with themselves. Yeah. And only the client is really being the one that's vulnerable within the room, within therapy. And we're doing another project on making therapy less scary and talking about different aspects of therapy, which is going to be the intro to counseling. And you will be able to find it hopefully when this airs on the Mental Health America Lakeshore website. But that connection between the therapist and the client, or the counselor and the client, whichever you prefer, is a really important aspect to therapy and something that is often overlooked when clients first started going to therapy. And could you just give me some information about why that connection is so important?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you don't resonate with your therapist or their style, so I'm assertive, I'm direct, I'm solution focused. If you don't resonate with that, I wouldn't be the clinician to work with. But how are you going to know that unless we meet each other first and kind of have those conversations, and be able to navigate that? I might not be the best fit for you, but how can I find somebody who has what you need? I would say though, so I tell everybody shop around for a therapist, because you will have better outcomes when you connect with your therapist. I mean, that's what the research shows. So that's what we should be advocating for, right? Now there's a lot of barriers that come with that, but I'm just saying. But then the other piece is what I would say, I think, generationally it may be different too. So I don't want to speak for all, but I would say that the pandemic really shifted the narrative, at least for me in my practice. I didn't talk about myself very much before. That's what you were trained in. Keep your lips zipped. And I try not to make it about myself, but since the pandemic, it just flipped it upside down. How could we not talk about politics? How could we not talk about gender identity or laws, or you know what I mean? These things that were going on because we were all living in it. And for once it was like, okay, I'm in this with you and I don't have an answer either. So that's really hard as a clinician as well, but it definitely built a level of connectedness with my patients that I've never experienced before. And allowing me or giving me the space and the tools to talk about some of those things. Obviously not making it about myself, but people feel more connected. You know, when someone's being vulnerable with you and talking about a trauma, and I can say, I feel you on a personal level. Okay. I wouldn't be sitting in this seat if I couldn't. Right. That really resonates with people, like, okay, maybe she's experienced something similar without making it about me, or any topic, right? I talk about my anxiety all the time in the book too, and when they can hear what I've gone through and the steps that I've taken, again, it brings this level of connectedness and humanness that I think sometimes can get missed if we're not working with the right clinician, and it's not the right fit. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. I think there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
One is like self-disclosure is important for a therapist because it makes that connection with the client feel less one-sided. And so if you can talk a little bit about your story, the client is probably going to feel more open to talk about some things that they've faced.
Yep.
And as long as you're doing that in a constructive and beneficial way for the client, that's a very powerful skill and something that you've used on me multiple times that work perfectly. And even I was sitting there as like, wow. But as a clinician, do you ever feel that disconnect with clients when you know that you're not making that connection with a client? Because I feel like a lot of times clients feel bad if they're not making progress in therapy or they're not connecting with their therapist.
Yeah.
A lot of times clients will put the blame on themselves, which is maybe something that they're there for in therapy. Can you talk about kind of when somebody should break up with their counselor, when they should go seeking another therapist?
Yeah. I mean, if it's not like, if you're having those feelings and it's not working for you, because remember, this is your treatment. And I think we forget that. And so if it's not working, I always encourage people, just have an honest conversation with me. That's what I'm here to do. If you're feeling that, disconnected, not connected, it's not going anywhere, be vulnerable, talk about it. Cause to me, those are assertiveness skills. I hope I've taught you that, right? I hope I've taught you to advocate for yourself and to do those things. And I am solution focused. And sometimes we hit a point where that's not going to work for the patient anymore. And we just have a conversation. I think a lot of time, and it can feel personal because you're in such an intimate setting, but it's not personal. And even though if it feels personal in the moment, I try to think about it later, and it's like, it's what's best for their treatment. So I would just say if there's more red flags, or the therapist really is making it about themselves, or you're therapist-ing the therapist, and it doesn't feel, and this can happen. I can have good success with somebody, but then we just reach a point where it's like, I think we've reached the max here, and there's no shame in that. I just hope that we've built enough trust and rapport that we can just have those honest conversations, because that's what it boils down to. And I tell everybody, listen, I use a lot of evidence-based approaches, but beyond that, let's just have honest conversations. Let's help in that way. So I would just encourage everybody to be assertive and direct. It's your treatment. And if it's not working, it's not working. And we don't have to make it more complicated than that. You can just talk with them and they can help you find somebody that could be a better fit.
And in a way, the counseling relationship is a model for healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
And so that being able to tell somebody what you need to make this work, or that it's not going to work, that's a sign of a healthy relationship. That's making sure that things are going both ways, that you're both feeling, well, this is working, or maybe you're not feeling that this is working. And more often than not, if you feel like it's not working as the client, the clinician is probably sensing that too.
Exactly. And so I just bring it up. I mean, I have one patient, I feel like I'm not doing enough. And I've said this with them and they're like, no, Kaitlyn, you are. I'm like, are you sure? Cause this, it's outside. All right, we'll keep going with it. But that's also me being like, hey, I'm seeing this, or, are we at an impasse or whatever that would be? Can we not go past this point anymore? Like, what are you feeling? And that's truthfully, if I ask them to be honest and transparent, I'm going to be the same way too. So I ask about it, and then I'm always just like, let me know. How are you feeling about it? Do we need to be meeting this often? Should we break it up and put it and see how many more weeks we can go out, and try to play with it that way?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so I want to go back to, not only do you have a master's in counseling, but you also have a master's in women and gender studies.
Yeah.
And I feel like that informs a lot of your work around social justice and a lot of your work with women's shelters and domestic abuse shelters. And I was wondering, how do you feel that the women and gender studies, that master's, helps inform you to be a better clinician?
Oh my goodness. That's a really great question. And what I would say is I wouldn't be who I am had I not had those experiences, have that master's degree, written that thesis, taught college. I mean, it was foundational. It was the hardest program I have ever been in. It taught me so many things about myself, but it also just opened my eyes to so many things. And what I liked about it is I liked that I got called out, right? Well, Kaitlyn, that's privilege. I've never thought about it like that before, And so those different types of things, called out in a good way. Hey, Kaitlyn, did you think about it this way? Because you've been in a heterosexual relationship your whole life. You've never had to think about walking down the street and holding somebody's hand. You're absolutely right. I haven't had to think about that. Thank you. So that's really what that program did, was open my eyes to all the things that are out there that I had never been previously exposed to. And it absolutely translates into how I treat other people, how I advocate. And without that, I don't even think I would be half as good as I am now when it comes to the things that I'm advocating and doing, because that was foundational in building me as a person.
Yeah. And I feel like, from my point of view, as having had a clinical relationship with you, that it definitely broadens your self-awareness. I feel like you are very self-aware, one of the most self-aware people I've met, because of that understanding of what different populations go through and what different situations people are in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the cool thing about it is, I really believe in a community approach, and I don't believe in top down. I believe in sitting in being down in the trenches with people. That's what I feel like I've been doing since the pandemic. I mean, I've been in person since the pandemic hit. I've been on the front lines of this, emotionally supporting people, and it's been exhausting, but also very rewarding on the other end. And that program, I mean, we took a class on grassroots organization, and it's a really a foundational piece of who I am. And so again, all these little things that I did within that program translate into the things that I'm advocating and doing now. And I would have never had that exposure. So, yeah.
You talk about being in the trenches, and I always think that from a textbook understanding, everything about counseling seems so methodical and it's so straightforward. And then you get down into the trenches, so to speak, and everything becomes infinitely more complicated. And there's an infinite number of challenges that people can face within counseling, from trauma to interpersonal relationships, environmental factors, ACE scores, which I definitely want to touch on. And so that adds a lot of challenges to your work as a clinician and the work that the client needs to do. And I want to get kind of your take on what this last 2 years has been like from that standpoint, the challenges from the standpoint of going virtual therapy, from having these major social and environmental factors for everybody on a grand scale to the smaller things that people are facing every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, on one level, the pandemic highlighted the necessity for mental health. I mean, it's always been there, but the pandemic, I feel like, put a spotlight on it. And the pandemic also put a spotlight on how we do not have enough resources in place for people with mental health, right? And we all have mental health. So again, it's shining a light on things that we already knew, but like now it's kind of like a volcano of explosion. So I feel like that's kind of top level things or high level things. But also it has also shined a light on the discrepancies and the, how do I want to say this? How terrible insurance is. And how, finding the right provider with those different things and the obstacles that people run into with just insurance itself, the obstacles that people run into with just even coming in through the door, right? Like getting them there. But then within therapy, it accelerated or highlighted symptoms that may have been there or new ones that people hadn't recognized before. And I will say this, the amount of men that have reached out throughout this pandemic, which is good on one hand, but also we haven't seen things like that before either, because they were also like, whoa, what is happening here? So I would say that is another piece that got accelerated. Now anxiety through the roof, the uncertainty, the fear. I mean, think about that. When fear is instilled in you and there's all these unknowns, what are you supposed to do? And then you're home. I mean, oh my goodness. And then to take away that school environment when maybe school was your only safe place. So now home was never safe. And so now you have to live there and to do those things too. So that was a lot of different things. So I don't know if you want me to hone in on one of them, but it just highlighted and accelerated things. And then also I didn't have answers either. So that was, as a clinician, at least for me, especially being solution focused, it's like, I want to help. Let's solve the problem. But you really couldn't. You just had to be vulnerable and sit there and, all of those fun things. Sorry, you can ask your question.
No, absolutely. One of the topics in your book I want to shift over to is trauma. Mm-hmm. And it's a word that is becoming headlines in the recent years, and becoming trauma informed is a huge, huge deal. Mm-hmm. And I still feel like it's a very stigmatized and misunderstood topic in mental health. And people have generalizations of what trauma looks like and what PTSD looks like, especially. Could you tell me a little about what your work with trauma looks like and how somebody goes around knowing whether or not they have some trauma?
Sure. So my whole thing with trauma is anything that dysregulates your nervous system. Okay? Think about that.
Yeah.
How many times as an individual, even as an adult, does our nervous system get dysregulated? And then think about that. And so that's what I try to teach people is like trauma is anything that dysregulates your nervous system. Okay. And then breaking down, I may have a patient do the ACE score. Well, let's look at your ACE score, right? That's in the book too, how you can do that. It's just 10 questions. Okay. Well, if you score higher on that, you have a higher likelihood of being in a domestic violence relationship. maybe having heart disease. You know what I mean? Like all of these other things kind of add up. So I try to work with people to understand and help them understand and give them tools, skills, to understand why or where maybe this is coming from. And I take a trauma-informed approach. So that meaning that trauma is everywhere. We've all experienced it and we've all had mental health. We all just need to recognize that and get on board with it. So once we can get to the acceptance stage, I feel like we'll be a lot better. And then having that foundation. So if I would have known, right, that my ACE score was this, maybe there could be programs that could have been more preventative instead of so reactive, because our field right now is reactive. How could we not be? Because we need to treat mental health the way we treat physical health. Once we start doing that, we could be taking more of a preventative approach. But right now, we're behind in that. And so my book is an opportunity to take more of a proactive approach.
For anybody who has never heard the term ACE scores before, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Yeah.
And what it is just a 10 checkmark list of different things that could have impacted you developmentally as a child.
So the ACE score is just one piece. You know, some people are like, oh, I don't like this. Okay, you don't have to. It's just one thing that's out there that you could explore. But now let's talk about generational trauma. You know what I mean? Intergenerational trauma, how things get passed down. Let's talk about, I mean, do you know how many times I ask? It's almost comical at this point. I'm like, do you know any family history of mental health? Oh, well, there was that one crazy, and people are still using that terminology. Okay. Yeah. But truthfully, I asked and still people don't even know the history. So truthfully, can we break the stigma without even without acknowledging the trauma that's happened through generations, without acknowledging, what I like to say is the trauma tree, which is also in the book too, acknowledging how those factors growing up, right? Your roots, so prenatal roots, right? Adolescent, teen, adult, how all those things have played a role in shaping you, right? And again, if we treat trauma like anything that dysregulates the nervous system, because that's what it really is, I think we could take a different approach on breaking the stigma of mental health.
I was just listening to a TED Talk by Bruce Perry. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Bruce Perry. So he's a neuroscientist that he works a lot in child development and the neurology of child development and what trauma does to children and as they grow up. And a really interesting analogy that the way that our brains grow is kind of like a house. And so you build the foundation first and you add on to that everything else on the house. And so when we have a childhood with unmet needs, I can't speak. That's like having a drunk contractor build the house, the foundation.
Yes.
And everything else is built upon that as we grow up. Our brain builds upon this foundation. All of that is going to be dysregulated because the core, the foundation of it is going to be dysregulated.
Yep.
And so we talk about our brains having different levels of our brain, and we have the very primitive kind of the lizard brain part of us.
Yeah.
And then we have kind of our middle functioning, and then we have our cortex, which is the higher functioning. And people tend to think that it's all about the higher functioning, where we can rationalize and reason very well, and we can reason with our emotions. But what he kind of shifts that it is that bottom up approach. It's not that top down approach where kids who can't regulate themselves at that very primitive kind of lizard brain aspect, they can't even allow anything to get up to their cortex.
Right.
They can't learn because that dysregulation is at that lower point. It's at the foundation.
You're constantly in fight or flight, right? Like
absolutely.
And if you can't move past that, you're never going to be able to go up, right? And so fight or flight is a trauma response. And I think people like constantly forget that. But yeah, I love that analogy. Absolutely.
And fight or flight can take many different forms. And you talk about it in your book, in the trauma responses. There's fight, flight, and then you added in freeze or fawn.
Yeah.
And so these are different.
Do you want to know something funny?
Yes, absolutely. Always.
Okay. All right. Well, side note here for the book. So it's like the next morning, it's about to hit the printers, and I had like the copy with me. And of course, Liz, who I do the podcast with, was looking through it, and she flipped to that page and there was an error. Instead of fawn, it said flop.
Flop.
I debated on whether to keep it or not. You guys, this is an exclusive, so you're hearing it first. And then had to scramble to the printer to see if we could get it switched before they printed like 1,000 books of it. So,
man.
I know. I was like, I don't think the mental health world will like it if I change fawn to flop. But now it's constantly in my head. So I just had to give you a side note.
It kind of fits the inability. So for those who have never heard of fawning, it's that inability. It's like the yes man. It's the inability to stick up for oneself. So you want to go with the flow and what everybody wants you to do. It's a
good analogy that I like to use is like a tiger. So if you're a tiger and your response is fight, you're going to fight. Right? You fight the other tiger. If you're fight, fight, freeze, right? But fawn would be, you would try to convince the other tiger not to eat you, right?
Okay,
So So that's kind of how I always remember fawn. I'm going to try to convince somebody not to do those things.
It's like diplomacy for one's own survival.
Yes.
Could you give me some background on each one of these? What do these look like and how do you see them in therapy?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times what we're untangling again is because we're getting it. Typically people aren't coming to therapy until something bad has happened. So we're untangling almost a lifetime of unhealthy things. And so what I try to do is listen, right? Listen to their trauma stories, have them write it out, those different things or what they're in here for, and then try to untangle it that way. And so if you've been living in a state of fawn, that's going to come out in how you talk about your relationships, right? And so I'm listening for that. Okay. Well, do you identify with being like, do you have people pleasing tendencies? That's how I like to ask questions too. Like I'm not huge on you're a people pleaser. Okay. Well, sounds like you have those tendencies. Let's explore that. People are more apt to understanding it in that way than you're a people pleaser. Does that make sense? And so shaping it in that way, I think can, again, make it more bite-sized and manageable. And I'll say things like, okay, well, I have resources, but why don't you go look some things up, see what you can find, maybe listen to my podcast on this or somebody else's podcast. And I'm big on Pinterest, and actually there is some good things on TikTok when it comes to I also try to figure out things that are going to fit for them. And then hone in on what modalities we have out there that could potentially talk about it. So I would, through talking with you about whatever trauma you're coming in for or whatever we're working on, I'm probably going to pick up on that. Now, fight, I think we can, they're going to say things to you that thus then fit that category. So I hope I'm answering your question, but
absolutely.
Each one, they're going to tell me and in ways that's not like, hey, this is how but I'm going to be able to pick up on it because I know what those are. And then we explore it.
And I feel like these terms, they can be a little outdated from what our current social sphere kind of looks like, where fight could be defensiveness. Whenever somebody says something, it's that defensive reaction, even if it's not at them, if the comment was not made with an aggressive intent at the person, they're going to be defensive, or that flight is going to be trying to stop a conversation or kind of isolating, not being around people.
Or if you see a pattern, I call them like hit and runs. Like things get tough, and then all of a sudden you've moved to a new city, a new town, and then you start brand new. You know what I mean? So a pattern of that would thus then play into potentially flight, right?
So on this trauma piece, there's a chapter that I found particularly powerful, and that was the Rape Chronicles. Just the name of it itself is a very powerful kind of terminology used. And I feel, to me, it was intentional to not say sexual assault, because I feel that rape has a very heavy meaning behind it and a lot of stigma around it. And to me, it felt like you intentionally used those words.
I did.
Could you give me a little explanation of kind of the chapter and why it's so important that we do address that term and address this kind of topic?
Yeah. Well, again, some of the top 5 things that I'm talking about with patients are in this book, right? And so I'm constantly talking, I work with trauma every day, specialize in it. So one of the main topics is rape and sexual assault. Now, this is the toned down version of what I originally had. My original draft of this, it was always the Rape Chronicles, and I was going to really, really go for it, and really highlight it, because in my opinion, we have nothing to lose at this point, right? I don't know what else we can do besides call it for what it is. And I went into really comparing it to Gilead, and The Handmaid's Tale, and but the editor really toned it down and obviously made it more professional. But I figure at some point, maybe I'll release the OG version of it. Why I think this is so important, I guess, it's been foundational to process my own healing with this specific topic. And it's probably the topic that I've seen the most transformation with people that I work with. Does that make sense? And so until we start calling it for what it is, what is it going to take? And I think that's basically what I say in the chapter. I mean, do we have to wear an R on our forehead, right? Do we and talk about these different things until we shift the narrative, because the narrative isn't shifting at this point. And the numbers only keep increasing. So I wanted this chapter to be bold because I don't see any other way to talk about it.
There's a real reason why we don't use the term rape anymore, and that's because people don't like it. And we feel adverse to talking about it. And that's one of the things that I loved about your chapter, is really taking back that word and using it in a way that it is powerful.
As it should hit you as, whoa, this is an issue. And that's truthfully I'm glad that resonated with you, because that was what I was going for. How are we going to change it? And the thing that, I think is even scarier is that we don't have male statistics, not good enough male statistics. And what I'm going to say is those numbers wouldn't surprise me if they're almost equal, or, and we need to start having these conversations, and we need to call it for what it is if we truly want to make effective change. So call it for what it is. We need other people at the table and talking about these things, because the numbers are only increasing, right? They're not going down.
I was just thinking on the word choice, and it reminds me of the reasoning why in beef and cattle, we don't call it cow meat, and we name it pork or a tenderloin, is we want to disassociate from the fact that it is a cow. We don't want to call it what it is, because we want to be able to disassociate it. And
Absolutely.
I feel like that's what this is, in a sense, is we're trying to water it down.
Oh yeah.
So we feel more comfortable with it.
Yep. And that can't happen to me, or that didn't happen to me. And part of the things that I hear in session, I mean, people are trauma bonding over this. Do you know how many women are like, hey, did this happen to you? You know? And the other one's like, yeah, boom, right? Trauma bond. And that's not how we should be connecting. So to me, that plays into, you know, even further perpetuating, like moving away from actually breaking it and just like unintentionally making it worse, because then we've told somebody, but now we both have this, we're bonded over it, you know, you're like creating this subculture. Yeah.
A codependent kind of situation with people.
Yes. But it's got to feel validating. So I'm like, okay, I can definitely understand that, but I would rather have connections based off of things that, you know, would create a healthy bond than, hey, did this happen to you? Oh yeah, that did happen to me too. Okay. All right. So I'm not alone, you know?
Yeah.
Imagine if we created a world where none of this existed, because it's not healthy and it's not helping anybody. And we talked about things that actually mattered. So
additionally, if you can only bond with people really around that topic and people who have had that experience, you're probably always going to feel somewhat alone, because there's a lot of people that you are unable to connect with that could be as supportive as somebody who has been through a situation like that, if they are an understanding and caring individual.
Yep. And I think I talk about it in the book. I can't remember everything I wrote. But you know, when I volunteered for the Sexual Assault Crisis Center, and I'm running support groups, and here I've got teens who've been sexually abused, and to have them say that it was worse after I told, like, still just rocks me to the core, meaning it's safer to keep the secret, right? And it's safer, you know, to not rock the boat, is scary. And for somebody who's 13 years old to be saying that, talk about insight, and then talk about how far behind we are with the systems that we have in place, because the systems we have in place don't truly support people who have been through this. And this is another layer. Why would they tell? And then think about males. Why would they tell? Well, we haven't created a structure that is safe enough for them to do that.
And I feel like with the stigma around males is we do have a stereotypical image of what sexual assault looks like. And we envision it very forceful, and where it's not always what's actually happening every time in the real world. And so it's important to talk about there's coercion and there's the manipulation, grooming process. And
typically, like when you know the statistics, often, you know, in our culture, we think it's somebody that's going to pop out of a bush and, you know, we don't know the perpetrator. But I don't remember what it is, but it's extremely high. What is it? 70, 80% that we know the perpetrator. Think about that. That's huge.
Yeah. It's also really scary.
I know. So hence why let's call it for what it is, because until we call it for what it is, we can't work with it. And you're right when what you said before is there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. Well, not me. That can't be me. You know, that statistic doesn't apply to me. Well, it sure does. But you don't recognize that yet.
So how does somebody know if they have trauma? Because trauma is so personal, and there's not one situation fits all for somebody with trauma. 3 people can be in a car crash and only one of them remembers that event as traumatic or has some kind of lasting trauma from that event.
Yeah.
So how in your work do you kind of reveal whether or not somebody has trauma? How do you allow them to figure that out?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely going to be a case-by-case scenario. Now, everyone has experienced some level of trauma, okay? That's just on some level. Whether they recognize it as that, I'm not necessarily sure. I don't always have to be the one to tell them, right? That is trauma, because it may not be to them, but something else that I might not think is trauma could be trauma to them. So I just try to keep it as open as possible. And that's where, instead of honing in on the labels, I'm looking at the symptoms. So I'm like, okay, so every time you go past this restaurant, this happens to you, you become dysregulated. You know what? That sounds like a trigger. Okay. All of a sudden, when you're walking this place or you wake up, you have a flash of something that happened that you said, okay, that sounds like a trigger, right? Or, like those different things, and trying to uncover it within the symptoms framework, and then saying, well, that sounds like a trauma response, or that sounds like it could be this, and then exploring it that way.
That makes sense. And I feel for many people, being told something is traumatic could be, in fact, be a triggering response for them.
Yes. But helping people understand the symptoms of, when people come in high levels of anxiety, you're not anxiety, you have symptoms of anxiety. So let's treat the symptoms. Okay. You have symptoms of depression. You know what? It looks like you're having symptoms of PTSD or these different things. Let's explore it together. Let's work through the DSM together. Here's what I'm seeing. Hey, I've got this assessment. Do you feel comfortable taking it so that we can explore it? And, the cool thing is so many people are so much more receptive to me being like, let's try this together. Hey, here's what I'm seeing. And this is what I do a lot. Like, okay, from the clinical side, I see this. Here's but then there's this. What are your thoughts? And then we just dive in together. And I think that helps, again, break down these bigger concepts and make them feel less scary. And that's why using words like tendencies or symptoms or, this sounds like a fight or flight response. Let's explore that. I think helps.
And that, again, just highlights the importance of having that relationship with your counselor and having that trust within your counselor, because that ability to say, hey, let's do this together, and we have a safe place here that you can take this, or we can talk about this, is incredibly important for people, especially for individuals who have had some kind of traumatic event that they have trust issues.
I'm also EMDR trained as well. So EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's been foundational, I would say, in my trauma work with patients as well, because that is a different modality and a different way to treat trauma. And when I think about that, right, the body keeps score, how we trap emotions in our body. Someone might not be ready or even want EMDR, but I'm still thinking about those concepts. And then I can still apply some of that into the work that we do on an individual basis.
So I want to shift from the diagnosis and the kind of mental illnesses that you do see into other aspects of mental health, specifically compassion fatigue and secondary kind of trauma, and how do you heal those areas? Because I feel like there is this stigma around the idea of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue within different workplaces, especially with people who are getting burnt out, who don't have the energy they're being asked too much of within their workplace. And so really that self-care portion, how do we handle these difficulties every day and with stressful jobs? And I feel like there's nobody better to ask than somebody who has found some of the most stressful jobs out there.
Yeah, right. What I would say is, on one level, I think we have to shift the narrative again and stop putting it on the helpers in this field to have better self-care, right? I feel like that's kind of a thing, like, well, you're in this field, have better self-care. Well, yeah, I know, but is the environment conducive for that, right? Because as helpers, like, we are intrinsically motivated. I want to help. It is in my nature. It is who I am. I can feel it. However, this field presents you, right? As someone who works with trauma, I have to be so cognizant of my boundaries, of those things, because the secondary trauma is so huge. Now, I have a very good self-care routine so that I can keep my head in the game and to do that stuff. And like, I kind of draw like with my mind, like an invisible line between each session. And I like visualize if my body's feeling heavier and I feel like I'm starting to take it on, I'm going to try to push it back or, rework the conversation so it's not all about me. However, depending on where you work, what institution you work if you have to retention and numbers and see so many patients in a day and case notes and, all of these systems that are in place really remove us from doing the therapy. Like the therapy is what I love to do. And it's probably the least amount of time that I get to spend. You know what I mean? But I also now, like with my own private practice, I can shift that narrative, but still it's not as much as I want it to be. I want to sit down with people. I want to do therapy, but I have to meet all these other needs too. So I would say, it's really important to look at the environment, and within that environment, it's beyond self-care now, right? It's what are these structures going to put into place to help me with my mental health as I move forward? And if they're not going to be able to, then I think it's up to the person to start making a different choice, which I think that's what really where people get stuck, is because they feel like they don't have other options. I'm not capable of doing those other things. So I'm just going to sit here because it's meeting my basic needs, right? Maybe this is providing insurance for me. Maybe, all of that, which again, isn't helpful for the overall of them having healthier boundaries or being able to take care of people. So I feel like it's a systemic issue, like high level. But what I would say on a personal level is I very much want to practice what I preach. I just do. So I'm not going to ask a patient to do something that I haven't either done myself, I'd be willing to do myself, or I'm already doing. And that's part of my integrity. That's just like who I am, but not every clinician. In fact, I don't know. I'm not going to speak for them. Is doing that. I think a lot of people want to, but then based upon where they are in their life and their needs, they may not be able to.
And that's something that we talk about at MHA Lakeshore, is that sometimes self-care is meeting Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
Like if somebody doesn't have their basic needs met, doing yoga isn't gonna be the self-care option for them. Right. We need all those basic needs. We need a reliable source of food. We need shelter, all these different aspects. We need good relationships.
Yeah.
And self-care doesn't just mean I'm going to take a bubble bath.
Right. Correct. But again, I feel like institution-wise, this is what people say. Well, you need to take better care of yourself. Okay, well, I'm trying while I'm also trying to help all these other people. I mean, this field within itself could use a refresh on supporting the people within their environments and taking mental health seriously, because we have it too. But we also have to be able to advocate for ourselves and make different choices if our needs aren't getting met, which again, I feel like a lot of people become afraid of that, which is okay too, if that's where you're at. But then what are you going to do with your mental health and your self-care to become emotionally healthier or not take all that stuff on? I mean, it's hard. A lot of people can't turn it off at the end of the night alive. So many people are like, Kaitlyn, don't you want to bring everybody home with you? And how do you do this? And so many people are like, I could never do your job. I'm like, well, probably not if that's the first thing out of your mouth. But what I would say is that like this job, like, I'm in the field of healing, and it's not pretty. It's messy AF, right? Just like the book.
Fudge.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And so you have to have a good sense of yourself. And you have to be able to turn it off. Sometimes I'm really good at it. Other times I'm not. It's a constant, I'm a work in progress. I'm good at it for the majority of the time, but then not all of the time.
I think we've even had a conversation. I'm somebody who is very much an empath myself, and I have a hard time sometimes distinguishing other people's emotions from my own and taking on other people's emotions. And we've had conversations about thinking about it almost like a light switch. Is sometimes we turn that light switch on and we're able to be there for people. But I think you've given the example that when you go home after a day, you have to flip that counseling light switch off. And now it is time for you to focus on yourself.
Absolutely. Yep. You're 100% right. I'm very visual. So like the white line, the light switch, like it's literally, I see it in my head and I flip it off. I'm not going to be on my computer when I get home unless it's, extenuating circumstances. I'm not checking my email anymore. Like those are boundaries, right? So having good boundaries is a form of self-respect. And so if you can't change your work environment, what you can change is those pieces that we teach other people, and you can do that at home. And that's what I try to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds kind of ridiculous when you first hear it, the light switch, just envisioning a light switch in your head. I'm somebody who's not, I don't automatically buy into things. So I'm a skeptic.
I wouldn't have known that. Yeah. No clue.
Kaitlyn's just like, this kid was so hard to work with. No. But for me, it was a point that I was just like, I'll try it. And it's very liberating if you can get yourself to the phase where you will actually just imagine that light switch and turn it off. Any way that you can really distinguish that boundary, I feel.
And you can play with it. See, I try to teach people, have fun with it. So whatever visualization works for you, or if it's not visual, figure that out and then play with it. And what I always was the building still standing the next day? Was my email still the next day? Right? And it is. And again, we get caught up in that, oh my God, everybody needs us 24/7, this and that. No, if you've put structures in place, you're going to know that, right? 24 to 72 hours, business hours, I'll get back to you. And I stick with it. And everybody's okay. And when I think sometimes you have to see it, and practice it. And then all of a sudden you're like, yep, everything is still operating. And so I don't need to be available 24/7 because that's not emotionally good for me or anybody.
Yeah. And this kind of pairs perfectly with the last topic that I really wanted to cover, which is really investing in yourself. And it's something that I feel another topic that is coming to the forefront, but there's this parity in the way that we conceptualize things like finance. When you think of finance, it's a no-brainer. Yeah, I'll invest. I'll take some money out of every paycheck and I'll invest it into the stock market, or investing in your career or education. These are the no-brainers, but we have sort of a detached concept when it comes from our own mental health or our relationships and overall experience of the world. Is this investing in ourselves seems something that is unintuitive.
Yeah, no, we haven't been properly trained in it in any way, shape, or form. In fact, we've been trained that it's selfish to think about yourself. Well, if I take care of myself, right, then I'm not being of service to other people. When in fact, it's quite the opposite. How are you pouring from an empty cup? Like that's how? Because if your cup isn't full, how can you truly give to somebody else? In fact, that's, to me, selfish to be trying to do that. You know what I mean? And then expecting something in return, because we shouldn't, if our cup is full and we're pouring into other people because it's the right thing to do, we shouldn't be expecting something in return. Right? And when I work with patients, what I try to say is this is a minimum of a 3-month investment in yourself. 3 months of you investing in yourself, right? If you can do that, you're going to have an outcome. If you can't, then you're not going to have an outcome, and that's okay because that's your choice. But what I'm telling you is that if you and I work together for a minimum of 3 months, we're going to see something, right? Or you're going to see something. And that's why taking care of myself and those boundaries is an investment in myself, right? Shutting it off, doing those things. You know, my morning routine is clutch. I wake up at 4:30 or 5 every morning. I do my visualizations. I have my coffee. I'm visualizing how I want my day to go, thinking about my manifestations. What I call it's like getting my head in the game. Okay. Then I go to work, which is my game, right? And I play the best I can play. And then I leave the field and I flip the switch and then I go about my life because I need that balance. We all need that balance. So if you want to invest in yourself, that's what mental health really is. And there's nothing selfish about it. So again, another narrative that we need to shift.
For anybody listening, I totally wake up at 4:30 too. Super productive. Get up at 4:30 and get to the grind.
Well, I mean, if you read what a lot of people, very successful people and like what their schedule looks like, and it's not what my schedule looks like, but I like to learn what other people are doing. And when you get your routine down, it can be very clutch, for you in a lot of other areas of your life. So it might not be 4:30 or 5 in the morning, but what I try to teach people is here's what I do. But now figure out what's the best time of day for you to wake up. What can you accomplish in that time? I get things done in the morning. I can't be doing case notes or things at night because now my computer's shut off too, right? So I better be good, or I better have my A game in the morning. So you can make it work for you, customize it to you. And the only person that can do that is you because you know yourself best. And if you don't know yourself yet, then it would be a good investment to figure those pieces out.
I have a routine. It's just my routine is at 4:30. Sleeping is on the agenda.
Sure. All right. Fair enough.
And so that last part that you said about feeling very unapologetic of investing in yourself and caring for yourself, and the idea that if you take care of yourself, you're better able to take care of others. It just brings up the last quote in your book that I just love so much. And it is where you said, I want to thank me for being me. And I loved it so much. And it wasn't in an egocentric or a grandiose way, but just a sincere appreciation of yourself. And those who can't see Kaitlyn, she was just dying of laughter as I said this. But I found it so striking because we view self-appreciation as conceited, but it was more of a warming gratitude for one's own self, and we can be grateful for ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's not, yes, you're right. Oh no, if I praise myself, then somehow that's ego. But you know what? I'm the one who wrote that book. I'm the one who put blood, sweat, and tears into it. And I reached out, got help, did these things. I mean, it's been a 2-year journey. And nobody trained me in it, right? I had to learn everything on my own. And I didn't have I've had obviously family and friends that support you along the process, but they have no idea what you're doing. You're like, you're writing a book? What? And so to me, genuinely, without me believing in myself or investing in myself, I wouldn't have gotten there. Right. And so I think it's just as important to praise, the people around you, but also praise yourself because you're the one who did the work. So, yeah. I want to thank me because I had no idea what I was doing. Nobody, think about that. How do I write a book? And that's okay, Kaitlyn, you know how to do research. Started researching. Hey, do I want to go the self-publishing route? Do I want to go the traditional route? Do I not want, you're figuring out all these things and you're stumbling along the way. And, it came together. So I figured it out and I was like,
it came together beautifully.
Yeah.
And could you just tell anybody where they could find this book or where they could listen to Tea Time with the Psychos?
Yeah. So if you want to listen to our podcast, Tea Time with the Psychos, it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I think anywhere you can find a podcast, really. And if you can't find it, I would just say email me. As far as my book, it is on Amazon, or you can directly contact me. I think it's my Kajabi website. I think that's the one I gave you. You could just Google me.
I can link it into the bio of this.
And then I'll send it to you personally. So if you buy it from me personally, I sign it and put like bookmark in there and stuff too. So the Kajabi website, if you want a personalized signed one through me, if you don't want that, you can just go through Amazon. Mm-hmm.
And then rumor is that you're still writing another book?
Yes. So like I kind of said in the beginning, this book is like the appetizer. That's what I feel. And each section of that, or each chapter, could be its own chapter. So currently my vision, and it could change, right? But I'm going off the trauma chapter, and I just in my mind have the title as like traumatized. And so working on how I want that to come to life. And I'm thinking that might be more book, where this is a little bit more workbook-ish.
Well, I'm so excited for you to release that book.
Yes.
And I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Yeah. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you.
Sure.
And I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Think on This podcast with MHA Lakeshore. If you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to our feed to be notified about the latest episodes. If you are interested in MHA Lakeshore and want to follow our work, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and our webpage, all of which are linked in our bio. Additionally, you will find a link to a form where you can leave any feedback or suggestions for us. We would love to hear what you have to say, so please reach out. Lastly, if you found that this content was of value to you, you can donate to us on our webpage by clicking on the yellow donate button in the upper right-hand corner. As a nonprofit, we rely primarily on grants and donations to operate, and every donation allows us to have a greater impact. By donating, you are supporting our vision of mentally healthy communities where all individuals thrive.